Now, here's the thing with this text, right? I think most of us sort of know that that is kind of easy to do when you're down and out. When you just know, like, man, nothing is going my way. The worst thing in the world for me would be to look at myself. You maybe have had those kinds of situations. There's sort of natural times when we know that we're down, that we need help. Just this morning, because do you know that there's lots of tunes that you can sing Rock of Ages to? No, you don't know that. That's great. Did we sing the right tune? I hope we sang the right tune, because we had a long discussion in our practice this morning, and I actually had to go find the right tune. But in doing so, I looked up the song Rock of Ages, and probably many of you know this. It was written by Augustus Toplady, and the tune that we actually sang was the tune Toplady by Thomas Hastings. But Augustus Toplady supposedly wrote that song when he was in the midst of a storm at Bennington Combe, near Bennington Combe, this hiking area. And there's actually this sort of, like, think of a rooster comb. There's this rock outcropping that looks like a rooster comb, and there's little clefts in there. And he was able to hide in the midst of this crazy storm. And he supposedly wrote this hymn while he was hiding from the storm. And there's actually a plaque there on those rocks saying that's where Augustus Toplady wrote that hymn. What I'm saying, though, is that it's easy when you're in the midst of, like, low place to say, God, I need to look up and find you because I am weak and I need you to be strong. That I think most of us understand. But this psalm doesn't seem to be speaking to that situation exactly. David seems to be writing from the place of being on top. He's the king. And what do kings do? Well, they're the top people. They rule, they speak, and people do what they say. And when they're on top, they think they can just look down on others. What happened when David was on top, looking down on somebody else? He did what so many people do when they have such power. They abused that power. They took advantage of that which was below them. Right? So he's actually speaking of being in the top place. He's saying, even when I'm up there, I need to look to the rock that is higher than I. Listen to this. This is why, and this is so strange in this psalm. All of a sudden, you're talking about God and being distant, and then finding him and being the rock. And then it gets to this section that talks about the king. Seems a little strange. This is why. Listen to verse 6 and 7. It says, prolong the life of the king. May his years endure to all generations. May he enthroned be forever before God. Appoint steadfast love and faithfulness to watch over him. What he's saying is, would the king even, the one who's at the top place, understand that his life, he's only there because the Lord has placed him there. His life is dependent upon him. His rule is dependent upon him. May there never be a day when the king does not need the Lord. Look outside of himself. What I'm suggesting to you is that the Psalms are always teaching us this thing, right? And we've talked about this summer. That all of our life is to be laid before the Lord. And there's times in your life when you're more inclined to do that, right? But this psalm is telling you that there is never a time when you should not be doing that. When there's never a time when you should not be looking up to the Lord and laying your life and saying, without you, Lord, the storm will come and wash it all away. Consider the image that this psalm gives to us about the Lord. Okay, I'm going to read. Let me read again a little bit of verse 2 and then through 4. It says this: lead me to the rock that is higher than I. For you've been my refuge, a strong tower against the enemy. Let me dwell in your tent forever. Let me take refuge under the shelter of your wings. So consider with me just kind of briefly these little images. One, it says that God is our refuge. And it's immediately connected to the idea of rock, of course. That's mentioned a lot, God is rock and refuge, particularly in the Psalms. We heard one of them in our words of forgiveness and peace from Psalm 18:2. It said, my rock, in whom I take refuge. Psalm 31 and 73 both say, my rock of refuge. They call God the rock of refuge, and my mighty rock, my refuge. That's Psalm 62. Psalm 94 says, God is the rock in whom I take refuge. It always seems to be referring to this idea that God is a rock and that he's a refuge, that he's a safe place, he's a secure place. But this image you can see is often related to David being a distant. He's outside of the home. And if you remember actually the stories we've been hearing in the life of David, he's been fleeing, right, from Saul and all this. And he's actually found his safety often in the caves of Adullam. I mentioned that the caves of Adullam were actually caves that were hewn out of sandstone rock. And so you can have these pictures in your mind of actually David finding refuge within rocks, okay? And so he's saying, God is this kind of refuge that I found a safe place, but at a distance still. Okay, the second image we have is actually God mentioned as a strong tower. This seems kind of similar, but it's also a little bit different. Okay, it seems similar in this, that a strong tower is probably built out of rocks, but a strong tower has walls about it, and it's actually not far off at a distance, but it's actually coming closer. Maybe you're on the edge of the city, and there's a fortress, and there's a tower from which you can actually engage with an enemy outside. And it's not just you hiding in a cave, but it's you with a bunch of other people around you defending what's happening. Okay, so David is sort of moving from saying, God, you're far off, to saying, okay, now I'm in a refuge, now I'm in a strong tower. And then the next thing he says is this: God is a tent, right? Let me dwell in your tent. He's there, he's moving closer in. And the movement is increasingly becoming more and more intimate, and it's at this point that we actually see it's really getting intimate. Okay, most of us think of a tent as something we only engage with in camping, right? And some of us wish we just had an RV so we didn't even have to engage with a tent. Back in the day, tents were actually oftentimes people's homes. You can think of maybe Abraham engaging with those who came to him out of his tent and welcoming them into his tent. But I want you to think also about how Israel was brought out from slavery in Egypt, and they made tents. They had tents there at Mount Sinai, and how God himself was given a tent, and he said, this is my home, and he was placed right in the middle of God's people. And that tent also was called the tabernacle, but it was literally a tent. And so some people actually translate this passage here as tabernacle. Here's what's going on, is David is using this language of being far off, and he's saying, as I look to you as the rock that's higher than myself, I'm making a movement of greater and greater intimacy towards you. He's moving towards greater and greater intimacy, from the refuge to the strong tower to the tent. And hopefully you noticed actually the second half of verse 4, it says, let me take refuge under the shelter of your wings. Which is to say, the final image here is actually of God as a mother bird, a mother hen, who's caring for her children. It's the most intimate image you have, and it's the safest and most secure place that's mentioned here. God's saying here, don't be so far off as a refuge outside of the community or a strong tower. Come into my place, my tabernacle, my home, and actually come right here, right to my breast. Here is the most secure place ever for you.